Yes, well, I was delighted that for both of the speakers, they've really produced a remarkable book. They are great enthusiasts, interested in history, and have been working away at a most unusual view of the history of Talla. And I think it's really quite fascinating. All sorts of stories emerging, and I look forward to them telling us about this. So would you like to take up the story, the Talla story?
So hold on, I'm just going to mute everybody, and then Matthew and Cheryl, you'll have to unmute yourself. So just give me 2 seconds to do that, and then I'll let you do that. There we go. So if you can then unmute yourself, please.
So, have you got that, and can you hear us? We can't hear you.
Can you hear us?
I can hear you. I can hear you, Matthew. That's perfect.
Okay.
So we'll begin.
Okay, well, I'm Cheryl Toomey, and this is Matthew. We live at Victoria Lodge, and tonight we're going to present to you a summary of a compilation that we put together of a book called In the Press, The Story of the Talla Water Scheme, which describes the construction of the scheme, which took a decade between 1895 to 1905. So the overview of the presentation will be in the following format. We're going to talk about the historiography, which is the thought process behind how you select the way you approach the events in history, why there was a need for water, the St Mary's Lock scandal, which basically boils down to a common theme these days, which is the argument between public versus private ownership, and where water sits in that in terms of a basic need for everybody in the community. We will then address the Talla scheme, which comprised 3 components: the railway, the reservoir, and the sluice keeper's house, which evolved into Victoria Lodge, which became the headquarters for the Water Trustees Board. We will then have a look at the timeline of the ceremonials that took place. The Victorians certainly liked their ceremonies and all of the things that went with that and the presentations. And then, depending on the time, we will go through some of the personalities that have emerged through the process of our research, including some of the key dignitaries, the contractors, and the clergy. And in conclusion, we will sum up why the scheme took 10 years when it was expected it would take 7. And we will give a final comment looking at the limitation of the research that we've undertaken and areas for future research. So we're going to start with historiography. Now, every subject has its jargon, and we all understand the word history. History is the study of records from the past to piece together the events from the past. Historiography is actually the philosophy behind history. And the first point we need to consider in historiography is context. And here I'm going to go to an anecdote. I was brought up in Birmingham, and my grandmother was born at the end of the Victorian era. And probably in the 60s, I was going for a walk with her, and she pointed out a beautiful Edwardian villa. And she turned to me and she said, "Do you know, I wanted to buy that house." And I said to her, "Grandma, why didn't you?" And she said, "You know, I couldn't raise the money. It cost £25. And I looked at her very disappointed, something that I still remember to this day. And I said, "But Grandma, if I'd have been there, I'd have lent you £25. And what this lesson in historiography shows you is that we have to put the events in context. As a child, I did not understand the context that she had lived in a framework of Victorian society. I didn't understand the effect of inflation. I didn't understand that this woman had lived through the Great Depression of 1929, and I made the mistake of applying my experience, my knowledge of an affluent world to a different context. And that is the first consideration of historiography, context. With regard to the Talla water scheme, we have to approach it knowing the context of the scheme. It was the time when Queen Victoria was on the throne, a reign that lasted from 1837 to 1901. It was a time of colonialism where the sun never set on the Union Jack. It was a time of optimism. It was a time of, at the tail end of the Industrial Revolution, which ran from 1870 to 1700s through to about 1850. And it was also a time of Dickensian morality. We have to remember we live in a much more secular society now, and you cannot judge this period in time without realizing the influence and the impact of the church. And there was also, to a certain degree, a level of moral hypocrisy. The second concept I'm going to talk about for historiography is stereotyping, bigotry, and bias. And I'm going to tell you a joke. I probably haven't had enough drink, but anyway. So one evening I was in London on a railway platform, and I was with my daughter, and we were about to go to London so that she could play a gig at a venue called the Barfly. And people were whispering, and when I looked around, they'd espied, some of the older members of you will know the name, Frank Carson. Now, Frank Carson was what would be considered an unpolitically correct comedian if we were to hear his material now. And the sort of comedy that he presented to us tended to be of the type, there was an Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scotsman at a bar. So feeling rather emboldened, and much to the disgust of my late teenage daughter, I went up to him, I said, "Hi, how are you? What are you doing?" He was on his way home, having done some filming. He was going back to Blackpool where he lived, asked what we were doing, and we talked about gigging and what have you. I said, "Oh, let me tell you a joke." And he said, "I've heard it." I thought, oh, okay, fair enough. But I'm going to tell you the joke. And the joke was, there was an Englishman, a Scotsman, and an Irishman, and they went into a bar. And the Englishman said, "I'm here to celebrate the birth of my firstborn son, but the hassle we've had trying to decide on a name. We've been through the naming books. We've been through the family names. And in the end, the way we decided how to name him was we turned to the church. We looked at the saints' names, and then we looked at the celebration days, and now we've decided we're going to name him George after St. George's Day." And the Scotsman said, "Well, that's a funny thing. Would you ken? We're going to name our son Andrew after St. Andrew's Day." And the Irishman said, "Pigorra, same thing happened to me. We're going to name our son Pancake." And this typifies stereotyping that becomes embedded and indicated in our language. Now, we're probably looking at the 80s or 90s when this sort of comedy was around, but it dates back to something that affects our scheme. Excuse me. The Talla scheme was largely built by Irish migrants. The reason they were here was because in 1840, the failure of the potato crop meant that there was famine in Ireland, and unskilled labourers and their families left Ireland in great numbers. They went to Canada, they went to America, and many of them migrated across the UK, and a large number settled in Edinburgh, doubling their representation in that city in the late 1880s. Now, the bigotry that the jokes expressed, stereotyping a race, is an indication of the reception that they would have experienced as they migrated. In reality, we could not have accomplished a lot of the schemes that were undertaken without their input. They were here contributing to infrastructure schemes, the laying of the railway, the building of the Leith docks, the shipbuilding on the west coast. They were in the cotton mills and had an important contribution to make. And so they are part of the context of our story, and we have to be conscious of the bias that was exhibited towards them, and bias that we will see when we look at the sources in the compilation that we have put together. The third part of historiography is the word history itself. It actually forms nicely into two parts: his story. And that is a limitation to the story that we've put together for you about the Talla scheme. There are no women present in that story. If you think about it, the reason is very easy to explain. Women did not get representation in the UK until the Representation Act of 1918. But that doesn't mean it was okay for men either. Representation was extended to them by the Reform Act of 1832, but only to men who had property worth £10 or more. So we've looked at the importance of bearing in mind the context of the time. We've looked at stereotyping and bigotry that we carry forward. Typhoid broke out in Edinburgh, for example, and it became known as the Irish fever. That is an example of the bigotry that just hangs about in our language. We talk about Dutch courage, and that's a reference to the fact that the Dutch were regarded as cowards who had to take a drink to embolden themselves before they went into battle. Language indicates embedded bias and bigotry. And finally, we come to the second part of the word history, story. For every person present at an event, there is a different view to be had. An anecdote. I was at a meeting last week, and it was a senior individual that was taking part. And at the end of the meeting, I spoke to my son who was involved. He said, "That was great, Mum. That was really good." And I spoke to my daughter who was involved. She said, "That was terrible. I don't think we're going to hear from him again." The outcome, only time will tell. My view is you have to be patient to catch a fish, so that story isn't over. However, we have to bear in mind that there are different perspectives to every event and every story in history. In the past, traditionally, history has been controlled by the people with the power. History, up until around the 1950s, 1960s, took a perspective that was from the top down. We only heard the stories of the monarchs, the kings, the government, the dignitaries, the clergy. There has been a shift in the study of history in modern times where we try to look at other aspects, other perspectives. We look at history from the bottom up, from the workers, from ordinary people like you and me, and what was our view of what went on. So the reason I've gone through historiography as an important facet to history is because when we came to look and research the story of the Talla water, we needed to know how we could avoid revising the story, putting our own bias, our own context, our own prejudices into what happened in that Victorian era. The way we decided to do this was that we were going to use sources taken from the press. So the picture of the book that we put together is actually the result of searching the archives, trying to chronologically piece together what happened. And we hear from the clergy, the dignitaries, the navvies, no women. We hear the sarcasm, the cynicism, libel that you probably wouldn't be able to get away with today. And for us, it brings the voices alive again and puts context and personality to the names that appear on the plaques at Victoria Lodge and in connection with the scheme.
So let's just move on a little bit and talk a bit about why Edinburgh needed a new water supply in the first place. And we've come up with 4 or 5 reasons, but effectively the first one was population growth. The population was growing very quickly due to the Industrial Revolution and other changes that were happening. And between 1870 and 1888, the population in Edinburgh grew from about 254,000 to 377,000. And a report in May 1891 basically said that there wouldn't be enough water by 1897, and so it was a pressing need. It was always there for them, and it came to a head really with the Talla scheme.
Okay, so we're just going to run through the reasons why we needed a new water supply. In terms of the population growth, I have also mentioned that there was a large migrant, unskilled labour contingent that was being drawn, and combined with that, there was rural depopulation as people moved to the cities for work. And there was technological improvements in the rural environments that meant that farms were getting larger and there was more use of machinery. During this period, in the second half of the 1800s, there were a number of seasons where there was drought, and this exacerbated the problems that were arising, particularly in Edinburgh.
So another key challenge was the fact that they lost a lot of water, and also a lot of the water didn't get to its intended destination through poor infrastructure. And on the left-hand side, you can see a picture there, because up until about the 1790s, they had a fairly large infrastructure of wooden pipes, hollow wooden pipes, and some of those are still being unearthed today in Edinburgh. And as a result of the poor water supply, they ended up getting a fairly significant amount of discontent and complaints to the Portobello, Edinburgh and Leith councils.
So the third reason why they needed a new water supply was that the water was restricted according to those who were able to pay. Preference went to commerce and industry and the more well-off. This created inequity in distribution, but you can't be a rich man living in Newtown when your neighbours have no money, are unable to access water, and as a result, disease is spread because bacteria do not discriminate according to wealth. And so the problems created for the poor classes, overcrowded into tenement buildings, had consequences for society as a whole. They were unable to undertake their laundry, they were unable to be hygienic, and there were knock-on health issues.
And the picture that we've got there is
Matthew, can I just butt in? Sorry, I don't think the screen's shared properly. Could I just...
Is it not? What is sharing for you at the moment?
I can just see you.
Oh no. Has it stopped sharing, or has it just not been sharing?
Has anyone had pictures? Not yet.
You've had no pictures?
No pictures.
Oh no! Oh my goodness.
Let's just see if there's a problem with that, because I don't know. I'm just going to go back and try sharing again. I've got.
You know.
Have you got the screen?
I would be able to
do it. Yeah, that works.
Yes, yeah? that we can see tenements now, yeah.
Right, hang on a minute, let's just have a look. Minimize that.
Yay. So what you just missed...
Hang on a second, I'll just...
Show the water pump.
Now, is that... Are you sharing... Am I sharing the screen now?
We can see in the press the story of Talla Water Scheme.
Okay, so
right, so let's just quickly show the pictures.
We got to there, look.
Do you want to show the water pipe, though? Because that's really interesting. So this is what the infrastructure used to look like in Edinburgh. This is a wooden pipe carrying water. And they're still finding these all the time.
So you did say to dial in early and sort out the technology, but there we are.
We felt too confident, didn't we? We felt too confident.
So, could you hear us?
Oh yes, we've heard everything.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Oh,
So-
you perfect.
You've been looking at me instead of the screen. That's horrible. Okay, never mind. Okay.
So we'll just carry on then. Really, the water.
So you take it. It's
Okay,
fine.
the water supply basically in Edinburgh was owned by a private company, the Edinburgh Water Company, and they worked for the profit of the shareholders, and there was no investment in infrastructure. With the antiquated system of pumps and wells and wooden pipes, it was very difficult for people to get water, and the distribution of the water was really on a profit basis. So they actually restricted water flow to the tenements by putting restrictors in the pipes.
In a way, this is the same old story. You know, do you leave utilities in the hands of private companies who've got to satisfy the shareholders and make profit, and the danger that to do that they don't invest? Or is it the right of everyone to have free water, and that it's the responsibility of society to put it in public ownership? And we're not going to answer that question. But this basically is the issue that we're looking at this time.
So the Edinburgh councils basically had enough. There were lots of complaints, complaints of different councils, and basically they then sought to put the water supply back into the public sector.
So up until 1840, right at the beginning of the 19th century, the water supply had actually been in public ownership. But a common problem that we hear nowadays, the councils were going bankrupt. And as a result, they passed responsibility for the water supply to a private company called the Edinburgh Joint Stock Water Company. And it took over the management and supply of the water. But they didn't invest. By 1845, the municipalities and the corporations had had enough. They wanted to take back supply. So they formed a residence committee, and they submitted a bill to Parliament to compete with the private scheme, with the private company. The bills were thrown out. But in 1856, they managed to get a clause into a parliamentary bill that gave them the opportunity to take back control of water supply if certain conditions were met.
Those conditions were really around the formation of the board and how they valued the shares and so on. But by 1868, effectively a subcommittee of the Edinburgh, Leith and Portobello corporations was formed, and they set up a review. Basically, it's one of a number of reviews that happened, and they appointed a guy called James Stewart, who was a very well-known civil engineer, and he worked along with a guy called Bateman, who it turns out had an interest at this time, around about 1869, in a pamphlet where he was actually telling us all how we could put trains through the tunnel a steel pipe tunnel between France and England. It didn't happen, but obviously it happened a number of years later. They had two remits in their report, and their first remit was to look at how to prevent water waste, and the second one was to look at additional supplies. And they effectively had 4 criteria that they were looking at. One was that it should be pure water, one that it should be from an inexhaustible source. The next was that it should be at the lowest possible cost. And the final was that it should be from a natural reservoir.
As a consequence of the survey that was carried out, a preference started to grow amongst the public officials that St Mary's Lock was going to be the answer for them. They put this in a bill, they promoted this in Parliament to secure the authority, firstly to transfer the responsibility of the water company to them, and secondly, to get authority to take a new supply of water from St Mary's Lock. But the private company were not going to take this lying down. They did not want to give up their authority. And they launched a competing scheme at Moorfoot, but they also began to undermine the case of the public officials for the St Mary's Lock scheme. And this became known as the St Mary's Lock scandal. Now, in our work, in our body of research, we have skipped over this. It's a really interesting part in history, but it is covered by a private book, a book that was distributed privately. 400 copies were published by one of the people who becomes a member of the Water Trust, called Judge Colston, and it's called an historical sketch of the Edinburgh and District Water Trust. But just to skim over what happened, in order to undermine the case for the public body to take the water from St Mary's Loch, and they basically already entered into negotiations with the landowner, who was the Earl of Weems, who at the time was away in India. To undermine the case, they basically began lobbying, saying that the water was unsuitable, and that people held protests in Edinburgh, carrying large placards bearing this image, which is, believe it or not, a water flea. Now, in reality, water fleas will be present probably in most large bodies of water. This was magnified, it was described as having horrible teeth, and it was completely over-exaggerated. Anyway, the passage of the bill went through the Lords, and as a consequence, they agreed that the powers should pass to the Edinburgh and District Water Trust, the new body. However, they threw out the St Mary's Loch scheme. Next. Unfortunately, the public officials were not happy with this at all, and they'd got their powers now, they could supply water, but they started to lobby Parliament. This was outside the remit of their authority, and as a consequence, the public officials were fined personally £19,000 for overstepping their authority and for promoting the St Mary's Loch, which they were not allowed to do. They were not happy with this, and it didn't seem particularly fair. And in reality, in the final analysis, the corporations picked up the bill, and the trustees did not have to pay the fines.
So if you just, I mean, we've got now to the stage where there are further smaller schemes carried out, but this picture here on the right, which you can see, I think probably a lot of you will have seen this before, but this is a picture from Talla Dam down the original valley. And if you look down the left-hand side, you can actually see the original road that went down the left-hand side. And obviously you can see the farm at the end of the valley, and then the stream coming down all the way through the valley.
So effectively, after the scheme, the road that used to exist was moved to the other side of the valley.
So various reports were commissioned, and they did look at St Mary's Loch again, but there was very little enthusiasm for it. And they also looked at the Pentlands and the Tweed area in general, and also the Heriot and Morfoot districts. And they ended up recommending the Talla scheme. St Mary's Loch was partly excluded because of cost, and also because they were going to have to bring water through the valley here mainly in iron pipes, and they were worried that they would actually have to be replaced regularly and cause problems with the quality of the water. So on 11th of October 1894, Mr. Wilson, the Water Trust civil engineer, made a final recommendation to go ahead with the Talla scheme. And they had estimated the cost of the scheme at £728,000. At the end of the scheme, the costs had actually run to about 1.2 million. And just to put that into context, in today's money, that's around about an outturn cost of about £155 million for this scheme, which makes you see that it was quite a significant investment. So on the 10th of January 1895, the bill in support of the Talla water scheme was promoted in Parliament, and it received royal assent on the 30th of May 1895. So they were all set to go.
If you just go back to the picture, just quickly looking at the picture on the right-hand side of the screen, this just quickly shows you the depth of the current Talla reservoir, with the darkest colours being the deepest parts. the top of the screen is Victoria Lodge. So you can see the depth of water near Victoria Lodge and the shallow end at the far
So
side.
the light green is up to 25 meters. The next shade is up to about 50 feet rather, not meters, apologies. And the dark green is up to about 80 feet. And
so this is a picture of the glen before anybody comes. And you can see, if you look on the left-hand side, you've got the road.
This is looking down towards
Sorry,
Talla
it's not the left, it's the right. Sorry,
it's
get my right and left wrong. And you've got Talla water running through the glen. Now, there was a poem written by Molly Tweedy Stoddart from Oliver, if I can find it. Just looking for it now. And just to read the final verse, she says, "Those who love the stillness of our little glen, come before it echoes with the shouts of men. Come before the navvies crowd the Talla Vale. Come and whisper sadly, solemnly, farewell." So the nature of the glen is going to be transformed into something beyond recognition very soon. Okay, so the Talla Water Scheme. It's a decade of construction. It's got royal assent. It kicks off September 1895 and doesn't get completed until September 1905. Picture on the right is as it looks today. The appointment of contractors kicked off from September 1895 onwards. Contract number 1 was building the railway. They couldn't begin the construction of the reservoir until they could convey the materials here. Contract number 1 was awarded to James Young. We'll go over that a bit more in a little while. Contract number 2 was the aqueducts. That was awarded to John Best. Contract number 3 for the reservoir and Victoria Lodge also went to James Young. And other parts of the water track were awarded to a name that you'll be familiar with, which was Robert McAlpine, known as Concrete Bob. At the end of the construction, the official opening took place on the 29th of September 1905, with the removal of the railway occurring between 1910 and 1912.
So this is just a quick sort of pictorial
Pictogram.
view of it. You can see that the railway started in September 1895, finished in March 1897, that the Victoria Lodge and Talla Reservoir contracts, which were let together, both started in October 1897. The house took until about October 1900, and we have an opening ceremony for it, and a naming ceremony for it. And the reservoir obviously went all the way through to September 1905. And then one of the things that the trust seemed to really enjoy, and I think this is something that a lot of the institutions at the time did, was celebrations. They would come out and they would have dinner and they would have drinks and they would do speeches and they would walk around, and then people would give each other gifts.
Lavish gifts.
Lavish gifts, especially from the contractor to the trustees. So what we have here, we have in 1895, we have the sod cutting.
And we'll go through the
We'll go through them later on, but effectively you can see that that there were about 7 or 8 different ceremonies. On top of them, they had annual visits. Every single year they had a visit, and every single year the press were there, and every single year they gave a really good account of what happened, the state of the scheme, and
progress,
and progress, and little views of what people were saying and doing.
Okay, so here in the picture on the right, you can see the track of the railway bringing the materials from Broughton to Tweedsmuir, materials being obtained from Carluke because there was not suitable mud clay available in the vicinity of the reservoir. In addition, they quarried stone from Gameshope. So the contract for the construction of the railway track and its intersections to the existing Caledonian Railway comprised 3 railway sections in the initial contract, but primarily the principle of the contract was to build 8.5 miles track up to Talla.
And one of the things that we found quite interesting was that at the Tweed Bridge intersection on the A701, there is a bridge there which was the final bridge that went over the Tweed for the railway just before it came up to Victoria Lodge. That bridge was originally a road bridge. It was intended to be a road bridge, and the new road, it looks from all the plans that we've seen that new road was actually going to go off the A701 there and follow the railway. And when the railway was taken up, they had intended that the route for the road down the left-hand side of the reservoir as it goes today towards Talla Linns was actually going to be across that bridge. Obviously, it didn't happen. We can't quite see when that changed, but it didn't happen.
So the award went to James Young for a bid of £49,113. Now, there's always a lot of inference in the press that some shenanigans have gone on with the bids. James Young was not the lowest. They are at pains to state it was the lowest compliant, but people involved in bidding to public bodies will understand that people play around with those terms. The final outturn cost was £62,000. And the first major ceremony of the scheme happened almost immediately when in September 1895, the public trustees took motor cars from Broughton Railway to just before the Tweed Bridge, and there was a sod cutting ceremony. So this is a picture in around about 1912 showing that the operations of the Broughton Railway, part of the Caledonian Railway, and over here on the left is a substantially constructed freight line that runs from Broughton up to the reservoir.
And that is the railway before it was taken up.
So here's another sketch that shows where the railway actually went when it reached Victoria Lodge. And if you look, Victoria Lodge is over on the right-hand side in the bottom corner. The railway approaches where Victoria Lodge is now. It runs along the front of where the current dam is, but it also branches off, and a temporary railway line was constructed that goes from where the current road across the dam is all the way up to Talla Linns. During the period of the railway construction, around 300 men were employed by James Young, and the progress made on the construction of the railway was nothing short of phenomenal. And by 1896, almost less than a year, the railway was virtually complete.
So it was diverted away from Polmood House, the country residence of Councillor Mitchell Thompson, and then down behind the Crook Inn. And the picture there you can see is Mitchell Thompson. He was Lord Provost of Edinburgh later on, but a councillor at this point in time. But he was obviously reasonably influential and managed to get changes made which an ordinary person certainly wouldn't have. The opening of the railway was reported on the 15th of March 1897, and the Water Trust undertook an inspection. But at that time, the Tweed Bridge had not been completed.
So we've got a little gallery of photographs now showing remnants of the railway. This is a picture at the bottom of Victoria Lodge. It doesn't belong to us, it's on waterboard land. And what it is the old railway in an overgrown.
So it's the railway platform.
So people would arrive, the dignitaries would arrive on the train, they'd step off onto the platform. Here you can see in the picture there, you can see the railway track running up past where the drive of Victoria Lodge is, and it will branch. You can see some trucks over on the right-hand side on where the dam is, and it would have also carried on up to Talla Linns.
And this picture would have been probably about 1905, 1906, so the railway hadn't been fully removed at that point, but the reservoir was actually filling up.
So when they stepped off onto that platform, these were the steps that went up to Victoria Lodge, which you can just see at the top there. Now, all around the district, if you look, you can see remnants of the railway that has now gone. This is an accommodation bridge. There were 10 accommodation bridges in the district, and they were to accommodate the movement of farmers and livestock. Here is a gate, which is at Mossfennan. Now, we believe this is a repurposed gate that may have acted as a level crossing at the time of the operation of the railway. This is these are the trucks that were used on the Talla line, and each contractor would bring his own trucks with his own livery. And here you can see the first contractor, James Young. And eventually his contracts were taken over by the second contractor, John Best. And we believe these trucks, these locomotives were blue.
Yeah, absolutely, and purchased brand new for the scheme.
So there are a number of accidents on the railway. The first one here, it records that on Saturday afternoon, navvies were being brought to Talla, from Talla to Broughton in a wagon in front of an engine called the Pug. This was common parlance to refer to the railway as the Pug. And near Wracken, they ran into 2 wagons on the line. The concussion caused by the collision threw the joiner John Veitch from Peebles in front of the wagon in which he was travelling. He fell between the wagons, was run over, and unfortunately was killed. This happened in July 1897. A second accident in 1901. A serious accident befell one of the workmen on the railway in one of the tunnels in connection with the Talla Waterworks. The accident was caused by a runaway wagon which crushed him against the side of the tunnel. Medical aid was summoned from Biggar, and it was found that the man received such serious injuries to the spine that he is unlikely to recover.
So John Best took over from James Young's contracts when James Young and Co. went bankrupt, and we'll come to that later on. And it was John Best who constructed the wooden halt at the Crook Inn, because he until that time the Crook had been run by others, but John Best actually took it over and ran it from about 1902. The railway was affectionately known as a Pug. And did become embedded in community life, and we know from talking to Duncan that some of his relatives actually would travel up to Broughton and Edinburgh on the railway at the time. So there was obviously some official travelling on unofficial travelling on the railway. It took about an hour for the engine to bring clay from Broughton, with long stoppages to unload, and obviously that was a bottleneck for the construction. One of the reasons that the construction took so long.
Why was the Talla Railway removed? Well, the water construction plan went way over budget, and selling the railway was certainly favoured by the trustees because it would help to reduce the outturn costs. More importantly, when the public body was given authority to build the Talla Water Scheme, it was not given authority to operate a freight line. For them to take on that function, which they really didn't want to do.
It was given authority to operate a freight line.
It was given up to operate a freight line, but not a passenger line. And they didn't really have the heart to run a passenger service. It would have meant a lot of legality in changing the responsibilities and the taxation and financial structure. Not everyone in the district supported the railway. Some press reports suggested it was a waste of money. In the press, on the whole, they tended to think that a rural area like Tweedsmuir really couldn't justify a railway at all. There was no economic case.
So there's a story that Sir Basil Montgomery of Stanhope, son of Sir Graham Montgomery, was actually against having the railway retained because one of the crossings actually gave access to the farm and farmhouse at Stanhope, and he objected to that on the basis that he thought was unsafe.
One of the leading advocates for keeping the railway was the Reverend Crockett from Tweedsmuir Kirk. He managed to rally a petition of 500 signatures, including from Dromella and Stobo and the district. And he put a case that the benefits of keeping it will be that the residents wanted it, that Tweedsmuir was too far from all the amenities, and so it would bring a lot of profit to them, a lot of improvement and quality of life to them. And he suggested they could bring post, coal and tourists. He said Tweedsmuir would have the opportunity to develop into a summer resort. It would be good to keep the railway in the event of an unforeseen accident. It would be useful in an emergency. And he said that the area was a heritage, and it was our duty to share this wonderful place and all the nature with the people of Edinburgh. Reverend Crockett also lobbied through the press, with the Caledonian Railway, with the councils, with the trust. The Caledonian Railway did give him a hearing, but they said if he wanted to take it over, it's going to cost £2,000 a year, which was really out of their hand. They couldn't raise that money. And eventually, in 1910 and 1912, the railway was actually sold for the materials, not the land, just the rails and chattels, to a company called McClelland for £6,431. So on to the construction of the reservoir. There were two main landowners from whom the trustees had to buy the land. The key landowners were Sir Graham Montgomery from Stanhope, who sold 4,800 acres, and the 10th Earl of Weems, who sold land at Talla and Megget. The land purchase was completed in 1896, and you'll note that this was after they'd started constructing the railway. In total, they bought the equivalent of 10 square miles of drainage, and by purchasing the entire drainage area, the ambition was to control and make sure there was no contamination. They favoured sheep farming over cattle, a tradition that persists to this day. Here's the picture. So they purchased the land. They've now built their railway to bring the materials up here. And this is a picture of trucks on the dam, bringing stone quarry from Gameshope and puddle clay from Carluke.
This would be around about 1902, and you can see the huts down
and Victoria Lodge,
and Victoria Lodge
up on its promontory. So the contractors, the first contractor was James Young. He was appointed to build the railway, to build Victoria Lodge. And his accomplishments were that by 1897, he'd completed the railway. Victoria Lodge was largely complete. He'd started the reservoir, but by the time it was a quarter complete in 1898, he died. Robert McAlpine was working on the water track, known as Concrete Bob, and John Best had been awarded a contract for the aqueduct. And the repercussions of the death of James Young was that his brother took over responsibility for the reservoir contract. They weren't up to the job. They incorporated the company, but they went bust. For 5 months, as a result, no progress was made on the Talla site. As a consequence, in the district, Talla Stores, Thomas Shortreed went bankrupt. John Best was asked by the trust to step in, and he agreed to continue unloading the puddle clay that had been left at the site. Everyone anticipated that he would take over the contract. In January 1900, he takes on the existing equipment, the huts and the contract, and work restarts. But during 1900, there is very little progress because they cannot get the labour force, who have been diverted to war in South Africa, the Boer War. He introduces technology to the site, which helps to speed up progress moving forward. These are the key facts, and as we're really running out of time, you can see the engineers are Leslie and Reed. It's 950 feet above sea level. 50 contracts were involved. There were 9 miles of tunnel, 12 miles of cut and cover, 12 miles of iron pipes, and so on. 24 million gallons to deliver to Edinburgh, 750,000 tonnes of material to make up the dam structure, and it would take 6 months to fill the reservoir.
And in 1906, they put in 5,000 yearly trout, and they actually had a trout hatchery here, which bred trout for other reservoirs as well.
So they had to compensate people for the effects of the scheme. So they had to give compensation of 2,250 for the effects on fishing. 600 men were employed on the scheme at its peak. And the towers that you see are the water towers or sluice towers. They're 15 feet in diameter and 90 feet high. They're lined with cast iron. And inside the one that sticks out in the middle of the reservoir, this is what you would see if you went inside. They're the gunmetal valves which control the exit of the water into the pipes. The valves are 3 feet in diameter, and when the water exits from the tower, it's conveyed to the measuring house at the side of Victoria Lodge, where it's filtered for fish debris leaves.
And then it flows from there by gravity to Edinburgh.
This is a cross-section of the dam. In the middle is effectively the embankment, 90 feet above the surface, 40 feet below the surface. Sloping banks were constructed in order to stop large waves forming and also to direct the pressure of the water down onto the slope rather against the embankment wall. The little tower that's by our dustbins at the end of the drive gives access into that clay puddle area, and twice a year the water board go in there and they inspect to check that it hasn't moved and isn't leaking.
And they use something like 70 to 80,000 tons of clay to do that, and the clay was what was really brought from on the railway from Carluke.
So some of the technology that John Best introduced was the blondin, which is an aerial railway. And what it did was it had a hopper, which you can see suspended. The clay would arrive on the train. It would be loaded manually into the hopper, which would be directed across the dam wall, and it would be released into the spot where they wanted. It was named after a cultural figure, Charles Blondin, who walked across Niagara River in 1859. Here is a picture of the puddle trench, which is, the calculations were wrong and they had to double the width of the puddle trench to make it actually safe. There is a story of some of the councillors fooling around and taking a trip on the aerial railway in 1900. And there was an accident where 5 men working in the puddle trench were hit when one of the ropes broke and struck 2 people on the head who were killed instantly. Action was taken by erecting wooden beams above head height so that it would hit the beams and not their heads in future. And this is a picture of a steam digger that was also brought to increase progress. So I mentioned before that the navvies were the workforce, and when he takes over the contract, he inherits all of the chattels of the first contractor. But who are the navvies? There's service soldiers, tradesmen, people who've come down on their luck, but there are also clergymen, gentlemen, educated people, itinerant workers, but they are othered by Victorian society and rather looked down upon. They were quite well paid at the Talla scheme. They were given wages of up to 2 shillings a week. Okay.
A lot of the money was taken back by John Best, though, through hut fees and food, and obviously owning the crook.
Here's a picture of the men laying down the puddle. This is a picture of the site with the workers' huts in the middle, Victoria Lodge in the background. Here you can see a picture of the hospital. I'm really aware that we're running out of time. So the men lived in wooden huts, and on the 1901 census, there were 200 men with their families and children crammed into 4 large huts, and there were 8 smaller huts, and these are some of the names that they were given. This is what it looked inside the hut. At the one side, there would be an area for the hut keepers and their family. There would be wooden benches and tables running down the middle. They were not much more than slum dwellings. And at the peak, 600 men would be involved in the construction, crammed into here. The hot plate, so they could pre-order hot meals if they ordered the day before, and they would eat these in a dining hall, and the hot meals would be provided at an additional cost. In addition to the club, James Young erected a recreation hall which had books, newspapers, could seat 300 men, and Thomas Shortreed baked loaves and scones. And the proceeds from the club were supposed to provide for the hospital. So there were outbreaks of smallpox at Talla, the first one recorded in 1901. And because peoples were not set up to receive these cases, the city medical officer, Henry Littlejohn, asked permission from the water trustees to make the corrugated hospital at Talla an isolation hospital. They agreed, provided peoples provided staff and nurses, and 7-foot fences were erected around the hospital. There's a mortuary there. In 1902, there were further outbreaks and one fatality. There was also a case at the Crook and in Strayton. Further cases in 1903, and they took it upon themselves to vaccinate 300 people at that point. The Talla Club is a major story in the history of the Talla scheme, because in 1897, James Young proposed to make a club, not for profit, he said, but to sell food, tea and beer. But John Gunn reveals to the press that James Young visits him, and James Young naively tells Mr. Gunn at the Crook that he's being lent on by trustees who helped him to win the Talla contract, and they have it in mind that they want James Young to take over the Crook Inn, and they're going to supply their own beer there. Following this revelation in the press, James Young pulls out and he says, "I'll sort the men out myself." They drew up rules, but unfortunately the whiskey carts came around and were leading the men into bad ways, over drinking. People were dying from hypothermia on the roads, and this news got out and a big scandal hit the press when it was reported that on Christmas Day in 1898, 42 men, is that correct? 42, yeah, were seen drunk at the door of the club. The clergy get involved, the Talla missionary advocate for the well-being of the men, and as a result, the trustees hold an inquiry, including taking evidence.
I needed a drink to watch that.
Is that okay? Are we too late? Are we running out of time? What should we do?
Are we okay for time, Christine? Not Christine.
Leslie.
Leslie.
We keep going?
No, absolutely fine. Just carry on. If anyone wants to leave, that's completely up to them. But I'm enjoying it, so carry on, please.
All right. So Bailey Archibald comes down on behalf of the club, and he holds an inquiry and he takes evidence. Now, the person that unearthed the story in the press was someone called Reverend Gray, who was from the Free Church in Broughton. And he gives complaints to the trustees saying, "You've got to get a grip on this. This is not good enough." And when they come down to hold the inquiry, they take evidence from the manager at the Talla Club, Mr. Rankin. They take evidence from Mr. Yellowlees. They take evidence from the Talla missionary, from Scottish Navy Mission, but the Reverend Gray does not attend. Now, he is absolutely ridiculed in the press as being cowardly, and Mr. Ross is humiliated when Mr. Rankin's evidence is at odds. And Mr. Rankin, the manager, says, firstly, the Reverend Gray's never here, he doesn't know anything. And secondly, Mr. Ross is mistaken. There were not that many men. Now, the press and the trust take the side of the club, and they say it's beneficial, it keeps them out of mischief, and we're carrying on.
So Mr. Andrew Ross was a missionary from the Scottish Navy Mission, and he clearly felt that that there was a big problem. But and he was ridiculed as a killjoy, basically, and ended up being supported by the Reverend Crockett, who wrote to the press and said that this is a good man and you've got to listen to him. The trust wanted to get rid of him. But what was quite interesting was that there was an open brawl, I can only describe it as a brawl from reading it, between Mr. Gray and Mr. Yellowlees, Mr. Gray being the Broughton Free Church vicar, and Mr. Yellowlees being the Tweedsmuir schoolmaster, in which Mr. Gray basically accused Mr. Yellowlees and a load of other people who were at the meeting of being in the pay of the trust. Mr. Yellowlees said he wasn't, and Mr. Gray came back and said, actually, you were paid to measure water at the levels of the weir, and the argument petered out, but not without them calling each other a couple of names.
So on the death of the first contractor, John Best takes over, and it's up in the air what's going to happen to this club. But certainly one thing that happens is the landlord of the Crook loses his license, and via shenanigans, John Best secures it. He gets a proxy application, and his own landlady from his own home, Warriston in Edinburgh, is installed as the landlady. And initially, his own son becomes the chairman of the Talla Club Management Committee, but he later steps down when there are financial irregularities. The manager of the club flees, and there's question marks about £200 that's disappeared. So these are some of the personalities who took place at the inquiry. Archibald Bailey is ever present at the beginning of the scheme, and he really drives the Talla scheme forward, and that's a picture of the Talla schoolmaster. So as I said, initially the son of Best is on the committee, but the bad press says that means that John Best Senior says if the club is lapsing now that the manager's gone, and if it ever starts again, we're not having anything to do with it. When the manager flees the Talla Club, John Best transfers all the liquor and food from Talla to the Crook. And the effect of this is really positive because the access to alcohol is limited, he controls it, but there are reports of tipsy navvies lying about on the road still. So John Best, he seems like the hero initially. He steps in, he rescues the scheme after the death of the contractor. He announces he's going to clean up the huts, he's going to give them clothes drying facilities and hot baths. And there are reports that he's now enforcing rules really, really strongly. He's limiting alcohol. And Mr. Ross, the missionary, reports that the behaviour is really good. And the Scottish Navy Mission report that it's actually a model site. But the press turns against Mr. Best. The hotel is in the control of Mr. Best. He owns the carts in the district. The landlady at the Crook is his. He pays for the police station and pays the wages of the police officers. He controls the Talla store and the bakery. He charges the workmen for their hut fees. He charges them for their food. He charges them for their tools. He charges them for their sick fund. So all does not look so great if you take the perspective of the workmen. The post office does all its business with them. The church holds services in his hall and raises money for their organ fund from his men. And on a visit by newspapers undercover, they unearth a practice called the system of subs. And basically, this is not unusual on construction sites, but from our perspective, and certainly from his, it did not go down well. Basically, Best was paying the men their wages, not at the Talla construction site, but at his premises, the Crook. So they had to go to a licensed establishment to get their money. And while they were there, they could take advances on their future wages. And the people that operated this system were the police officers, and this was in the open. And when the press challenged Mr. Best, firstly, it was confirmed by the superintendent of the district that this actually happened. Mr. Best admitted that it did happen, and he said he would stop that and he would start to pay them at the work site in future. So Victoria Lodge, it was the third arm of the scheme. It was built mostly by James Young. It was completed by John Best. It cost £1,600, designed by Leslie. It's in two parts. The trustees' accommodation, which was a large dining hall, a panelled ceiling, panelled walls of pitch pine, spacious entrance hall, kitchen, lavatory, cloakroom, upstairs smoking rooms and bedrooms. and a less grand part of the house, which was for the sluice keeper for running the works. And he had also, as well as a house, a yard, a coach house, a stable and a byre. And in the 63rd year of Queen Victoria's reign in 1900, the trustees were angling to get Queen Victoria to come and open the scheme. It was nearing, she'd done it for the Katrine Lock, and they named the lodge Victoria Lodge in her honour. Unfortunately, she doesn't survive long enough. And on the occasion of this ceremony, a gold key is meant to be presented to Mitchell Thompson, who lives at Polmood, but it goes missing, and so it never gets presented.
And the provost basically wished that there should be portraits placed in the lodge, especially of Bailey Archibald, but we haven't seen any of them.
If they came, they're not here now. So these are the crests that are in the drawing room currently, and they're basically the armorial plaques of the municipalities of Leith,
These
Portobello.
were placed in the lodge in about 1907.
And these are the names of the dignitaries that were informed in the scheme, and this is above the Inglenook in the current drawing room of Victoria Lodge. So now quickly the celebrations, and these are the main ones if we quickly run through them. This is the sod cutting ceremony where they come up in motor cars. Andrew MacDonald is presiding, and his wife, as decoration, lifts the sod. They have lovely food. Mr. Crockett, the Tweedsmuir minister, diverts from the programme, and he holds the little service, which even the hard-hearted press report as being extremely moving. And lots of wonderful silver presentation items are given to Mr. MacDonald and his wife. We have another ceremony for the opening of the railway in 1897. Luncheon is served at Tweed Bridge, and they have dinner at the Crook. Memorial stone laying at Victoria Lodge. This stone is actually outside the, on the external wall of Victoria Lodge. It was supposed to go inside the vestibule, with that changed. And people came out in the district to wave flags and support it. And here they are standing on a little wooden platform, and they have silver mortars and mallets to actually put the memorial stone in place. Now we're nearly at the completion of the reservoir. It's 1905, and they're ready to fill the reservoir with water, and the shutting down the valve ceremony begins that process of bringing water from Talla Dam under pressure and by gravity through the central pier to start in the water to start filling the reservoir, and it's expected it will take 6 months to fill. These are people standing on what became the water house in the middle of the reservoir. They're standing on the top before it's completed for the ceremony. And then here is a picture of the grand opening of the reservoir, Victoria Lodge at the back, train in front that's brought the dignitaries. In the foreground, the little grey cottage is the policeman's cottage, complete with cells. This is now present day double cottage.
Yeah. And the other cottages have been demolished as well.
Again, this is another picture of the ceremonials. And what happened was Lady Cranston, the wife of the then Lord Provost of Edinburgh, pushes a little button to open the reservoir. And then Mrs. Mackey, who is the wife of one of the provosts, pushes another little button, and she releases the waste compensation water into the weir. So a memorial to the workmen and the fatalities is in Tweedsmuir Kirk. It's worth bearing in mind that there are about 30, but seriously, for a 10-long project, although no life lost is acceptable, the number of fatalities due to accidents was relatively low, and a lot more were attributed to abuse of alcohol. So here are a couple of the personalities. Andrew MacDonald was the first Lord Provost, and he was one of the only 2 people really that survived all the way through the scheme. The picture of the stone outside Victoria Lodge bearing his name is there. People were brutal to him in the press. He basically was a draper from Edinburgh, And the press regarded him as rising above his station. He was knighted. He was regarded as sarcastic, sticking his foot in it, and like the high life a bit too much. I don't think you'd get away with giving that sort of description of someone these days. Mitchell Thompson grew to great heights. His country residence was in Polmood. He became the Lord Provost of Edinburgh, and he was the first person to wear this chain in that office, and it's still used today. He presided over granting the freedom of Edinburgh to Edward VII. In 1900, Queen Victoria gave him the honour of Baronet of Polmood. There was an incident in 1898 on an annual inspection where he went up the railway in a little wagon to inspect the progress, and on their way back, the engine was at the rear of the wagons and one of the wagons came off the rail. They all had to get out and they watched as the wagon was lifted back onto the rail. Also, he entertained guests of the trustees at his house in Polmood, and Mitchell Thompson took part in that. Two further provosts were involved in the Edinburgh Law Provosts were involved in the scheme. James Steele and Robert Cranston presided over the opening. I'm so sorry, this has run on too much. So that's a summary of the first contractor. What was interesting about him was he got most of the contracts from the trustees when they were alive. They had a lot of confidence in him. He rose through the ranks. He was like a colonel of men, having 3,000 men in his employ. But he was deaf. He became deaf as a child. He lost one of his eyes in an accident at Stirling Bridge when he was 33. And he was a great judge of horses and was a great horse breeder. And the reason he died, he wasn't so old actually, was he about 30?
In his 30s.
He was in his 30s. He was out shooting, caught a chill, and then got pleurisy. So it was all very unexpected. John Best, the second contractor, was from Kilmarnock. He was an expert in infrastructure and railway schemes. Died when he was 69 years old, and the implication is that he had a car accident on one of his visits to Talla in 1905. He was chauffeur driven and he was on his way back to Edinburgh, and when he reached Broughton, his chauffeur swerved because of an oncoming horse and they went straight into a wall. And they say that he never really recovered from that car accident. So before we talk about the clergy, we're nearly coming to the conclusion now. I do apologise for running over. This is a little picture of Christmas, the final Christmas at the Talla construction scheme in 1904. They know the scheme's nearly finished. And Mr. Ross, the Scottish Navy missionary, and the Reverend Crockett from Tweedsmuir holds a Christmas service, and they've been holding them for, I think it's 6 years. And because they know it's going to be the last time they've been together, they sing hymns, they give an address. Every child is given a gift as they strip the tree bare, and every man, organised by Mrs. Ross, is given a muffler, a pair of socks, a belt. Over the life of the scheme, the clergy administered to 24,000 men over a period of 8.5 years. So Mr. Ross, he lived in Tweedsmuir during the construction project. His son spent 8.5 years of his childhood here at Talla, and you will see Mr. Ross's son's name commemorated in the foyer of Tweedsmuir Kirk because he fell during World War I. Mr. Ross was very highly regarded, and in a report in the press, the navvies, in one of the few occasions where we hear their voices, said he was their best friend. He was a doctor, a nurse, a missionary, and everything to him. He took interest in the children, he helped the mothers, and he was highly respected. And they said if they tried to take him away from the scheme, like they'd taken away George Mason, they would rebel. And Reverend Crockett, someone in our view, and we're being revisionist now, who we think has been overlooked in the legacy of Tweedsmuir. Not only was he the chaplain to the navvies, he ministered to them, he lobbied to keep the railway here. He was an eminent expert in Sir Walter Scott, but we feel that his light has really been hidden under a bushel. So the conclusion, why did it take so long? So we've just got 2 more slides now. Sorry for being so long. So the infrastructure project was challenging. It was a phenomenal endeavor. So let's not underestimate how difficult it was. There were unforeseen problems. They had to double the puddle trench because it wasn't strong enough. So that meant double the amount of materials. And also they had to change their technology to use a system of air pressure to move the clay puddle around. And they said this was operated by Italians, which of course meant it was slower. Again, a case of stereotyping. So the rock bed that they were excavating down to, it was much deeper than they anticipated, and that created delays. And also they didn't anticipate the presence of peat, which discolors water, and there's some local comment about the water in the loch having weird colors, having microbes in, and people weren't completely confident in the quality. There were lots of pitfalls as they lost contractors through death, engineers. The loss of James Young, the first contractor, caused stoppages at the site for almost 5 months where nothing happened. In 1901, a tunnel collapsed. Again, they had to redesign it to increase the strength. There were political factors where they just couldn't get the men because men were redeployed at war. During the winter, it was very hard to make progress because for 6 months, it was quite difficult to work here. The valley is secluded and it was difficult to provide food and housing and keeping the men working here. Because the materials weren't available locally, they all had to come in. It took a long time to get the train here with the materials. It was an hour uphill. They lost engineers. There were changes of contractors and officials. And by the opening ceremony, only Mr. MacDonald and ex-Provost Wood were from the original contingent that started the scheme. In conclusion, and we're sorry we've overrun, the Talla scheme is an important feature of Tweedsmuir. Its impact has not, in our view, been adequately documented. Some oral tradition exists in the community. We came to know about the Talla scheme through the Superintendent of Works, Campbell Kirchin, who may or may not be on this talk. And we felt it needed to be recorded, and there is still room to record interviews with people who are descendants or were associated with Talla. We're trying to piece the story from the perspective of the press. We've started the process of excavating facts and giving voices to people from the time. This story, with its key players, are in danger of disappearing unless we preserve it. Our book, In the Press, The Story of the Water Scheme, is a step towards the preservation of the story. The story we've compiled is just the beginning of the research, and we hope others will be inspired to build on it with more research, more perspectives, and more revelations. Thank you very much. Oh, and there we are in the tunnels.
Oh, thank you very much, Matthew and Cheryl. I'm just going to suggest that if anyone has any questions, they might like to ask questions now. You can either wave at me or you can unmute and ask questions.
We've worn everyone out.
Can I just share an observation, which is actually not to do with Talla, but the building of Frood. And living in Broughton, just at the corner of the bigger road, I distinctly remember, as others in this, like Mary Smith for one, will remember, with all the lorries, Tinto lorries that came down with clay to build the clay puddle and the Frood scheme. And I'm almost sure they came from Carluke as well.
Yes, the trustees actually bought clay fields at Carluke to maintain access to that material. So it wouldn't surprise me at all. And it was a very difficult process. They had to stir it up, add water, leave it overnight, and then lay it 6 inches at a time. So it was a very laborious, very slow process.
You must all be asleep. I'm really sorry.
You probably should be watching Strictly. We can do you a jive if you like.
Duncan, would you like, was that you waving at me, Duncan, or?
Yes, I've just unmuted. Hello.
Hi.
I think that was fascinating. I really do. I've read your book with great interest, but this expanded the whole perception of the project, filling it in with all sorts of interesting details. So really, I think it's a great bit of work and a very fascinating talk.
Oh, that's great to hear. Thank you.
I agree.
Very good indeed.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
John, were you waving at me? Did you want to ask a question, John?
Yeah, thank you for telling me about my great-grandfather.
Right, are you Mr. Yellowlees?
Yes, whose family history I have here. I'm here at the invitation of Colin Shearer, whom I've never actually met except online due to the way we live now. I was going to say about railways, which was his and my primary interest in all of this. I never understood. I could see why the line was closed. It had hardly any traffic, and after all, unlike a railway to a mine, it was going to a place with a finite life. And you can see near Crawford on the West Coast Main Line another route that was built and taken up after the dam was complete. But I do remember in the 1960s visiting the then teacher at Tweedsmuir, Mr. Finlayson, who was quite clear that there should be an express service from Tweedsmuir to Edinburgh with only about a couple of stops. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
It is worth reading the exchange between Mr. Yellowlees and Mr. Gray in the press. There are about 3 or 4 exchanges, and it's quite fascinating how they spoke to each other.
And at the end of the day, we can't really conclude who is right and who is wrong in terms of the benefits, because it is clear that with the Talla Club, they reduced the deaths from exposure as men went in search of drink. And also it was a different time with the influence of the temperance movements. Some people regarded drink as evil, but could you really keep all of that number of men here and deny them drink? They would just go to Peebles, they'd take the trouble elsewhere. So I don't think we can pass judgment. We can only read what was written.
An Edinburgh author called Andrew Drummond wrote the biography of the man who built the railway to Ullapool. There is no railway to Ullapool, so it was obviously a fiction, but my great-grandfather comes into the book because the hero is recruited to help build the Talla Railway, and there's an altercation. He stays out all night listening to an evangelist, sleeps in the coal place in the schoolmaster's house, is intercepted in the morning by Mrs. Yellowlees and is told to leave.
Great! That's exactly the sort of
story
we want.
We need to be recorded, really.
Yeah,
you know? It's all those little tidbits that people enjoy so much.
I could put you in touch with him if you like. I'll do that through Colin.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just also say, I want to sort of come and I remember Broughton Primary School, Mr. Fox was the headmaster, and he took primary 6 and 7, I think it was, up to Talla, and we went to the far end, but we also went into, and you mentioned it there in the talk, I distinctly remember seeing where sort of the leaves and sticks and the most obvious debris was taken out of the water before it went in the pipe. But what he said at the time, I don't know if it was right, is that the water we drank at Broughton at the time was that same water. It hadn't gone all the way to some additional filtration plant up in Edinburgh. So what was...
That's quite interesting, because what we've discovered, we thought, because we get our water pumped from just down here at the measuring house. But we thought that we were getting it from the measuring house. It would appear that it's been down to Edinburgh and back again.
That's quite recent, I believe.
Must
be.
Yeah. I think.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just looking through. I can't see everyone at one time. So is anyone else waving at me? If not, I might just ask Gavin if he would give a vote of thanks, please, to Cheryl and Matthew.
Oh, you'll need to...
Hold on. You're not. You're muted at the minute, Christine. Get unmuted. You were unmuted, and now you're muted. Got you. Technology challenges us again. You broken.
Right. Okay, I think. Well, on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you very, very much for a fascinating insight to our local heritage roundabout. There's lots of things that I think some of us have been aware of, but lots that most of us have not been. There's so many different aspects that you've covered that we've not been aware of, and I thought it's been extremely interesting and a fantastic insight to some of the stuff that's going on. A couple of points. I mean, certainly Mitchell Thompson was the person who designed and built our house at Palmwood. There was one of the references to 42 drunken people cooking that. I think sort of recently, I think I might have seen an awful lot more than that, and we got away with it then. So that's something that's sort of built over the years, and we're still hoping to build on again.
Yes, definitely.
It seemed quite harsh to think about doing something with 42 just. I was very privileged a few years ago to get down inside Talla, and was very pleased to see some of the photos that you had, and I could reference to them quite easily. And it's such a brilliant bit of heritage that we have round about. It was very, very interesting. I hope people do get your book and have another look at that and a good read. It's some of the fascinating stuff that you've went into. It was very, very good.
We'll also send the presentation so that that can be worked on. And what we hope is that it's heritage material that people can use as base research material to do other things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously we couldn't cover all of the slides and we had to skim through. We haven't actually run through the presentation before, so we weren't sure how long it would take. But we'd love people to have the presentation and maybe pick up on some of the things that they might like to research or contribute and pad out the information if they know anything.
Well, I mean, it would be fantastic, Cheryl, because one of the projects we're working on is we are trying to collate all this heritage about Tweedsmuir. I mean, there's so many fascinating things that I can't believe has happened in Tweedsmuir. I mean, it's such a small place for so many amazing people to have visited, like really important people to have visited. So definitely that would be a huge asset to the community if we could keep that.
Absolutely, you can do what you want with it. That's what it's.
Cheryl.
No one owns history. No one does. We all own it. We all have our own view of it.
We were concerned not to put our view on it because obviously we're in a small community as well, and you can't.
And as we see, the schoolmaster's son is here. So you're talking about people who are here. They still live here, and this is their story.
And so you can't start putting a perspective on that. No. It's got to be as reported independently.
We can't understand the perspective given how different that time was, and the moral judgments and the importance of the church. We live in a much more secular society, so we can't begin to pass judgment on it, and that's very important.
But it's great, the work that you and Duncan and Christine and everyone are doing is great, and we enjoy it. We thoroughly enjoy it. We don't actually
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to get out of my pajamas this evening.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. I know it's a very different way to access these sort of community events, but I think this has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed it, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much
everybody for opening your Zoom accounts and still enjoying this talk from your own home. Thank you very much, and good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.